Hello, hello.
Hi, everyone.
Mm. I want to talk this morning about something that is really utterly and completely basic to our every experience, and also likewise utterly basic to the teaching, the perspective of our teachings, and something that's maybe hard to describe, like some of the most important things are. So I'll start with this. I remember when I was 11, my mother took me on a boat to Europe to see or visit relatives, and it was the first time crossing the ocean for me. And I remember how absolutely delighted I was in this new experience to just stand, on the bow and look at the ocean and see the waves. If it was the back of the ship, the way what do you call it, the wake, how the waves, they just kept flowing and flowing and flowing, and then wherever you look there was water, and it was moving sometimes, and it was always water, and looking at the sky. And I just noticed that I really, really liked it. And I sort of wondered why. And somehow we befriended. There was another kid on the boat who was more or less my age, whose father was a psychiatrist. So very wise. And even then, I thought he must be very wise. And I asked him, he stood on the deck with me once, and I said, "Well, why is this so fascinating?" And he said something like, "Well, it's just seeing the repetition of the waves, the repetition over and over again is maybe kind of mesmerizing." He said something like that. I don't remember his exact words, but I remember being interested and also just a little dissatisfied with his response. So, from the perspective of, many decades later, and all the experience with practice that we have encountered together, and particularly, of course, being within the compass of Dzogchen, the great completeness. The great completeness is obviously at every level we can understand that it's a teaching of wholeness. It's one of the meanings of completeness. Everything is present and nothing is excluded. And this is one way a mysterious, startling statement when we first hear it, perhaps, something that our rational mind is maybe immediately wondering about. But the rational mind is never in a state of wholeness. Thinking, by definition, in the way that the Indian and Tibetan Buddhist traditions understand, the workings of the mind, thinking is always thinking about this and therefore not about that. And thinking is always involved in judgments, or often at least involved in judgment. I like this, I don't like that. That is not a state of completeness, generally speaking. It is a state of seeking to, not just seeking, but creating a kind of hierarchy and a sense of this being better, more favorable than that, this being less so, and my orientation going this way, at least I'd like it to, and kind of turning my back on this other thing. And we do have, as you well know, in Buddhist traditions, a what often is presented as a fundamental kind of dichotomy, here we are seeking liberation, here we are in the midst of samsara, seeking nirvana, which even is translated into Tibetan as a passage beyond sorrow, like we're getting away from something, going to the other shore. So if we have this idea of a kind of movement beyond, outside of, that will leave something in the dust eventually, like our own suffering, that's very understandable. And indeed, it has its place in the tradition itself. We need to have a strong wish, first of all, a recognition of our situation in samsara. And samsara really, in the end, is the flux of our own mind, the judgmental love, hate, everything in our own mind that is anything short of freedom from being dominated by whatever arises in our own mind. So generally speaking, we don't live in a state of wholeness, but I feel we always aspire to it. The fundamental practices that we do, if we look at them from the perspective of wholeness, are openings to a wider horizon. The cultivation of attention, mindfulness, the ability to allow thoughts to come and go, to not chase after them, to not identify them, which actually is a process of learning, as you know, begins with our simple observation of our breath, which we will be doing shortly. We observe our breath, and we have the opportunity to notice when we get distracted, which is already a kind of waking up, and just come back to the breath. And if good thoughts come, bad thoughts come, either way, we treat them the same. We at least seek not to get entangled in them and to come back to the breath, come back to the breath. And being aware of whatever the experience of the breath is. And for those of you, which I think is pretty much everyone, who did the pith practices with us at our previous retreats, that first pith practice of Jigme Lingpa, where we are letting go as we are able of support for thinking about the past, the present, and the future. And then we relax, we ease into a state of openness. However we understand that, Jigme Lingpa doesn't explain. From our own practice and experience, we have a sense, or from taking walks and looking at the sky. You have a sense of what openness means, and you remember it's specifically defined as not being tethered or encumbered by any particular thought, not being dragged off the vastness of our natural horizon by any particular thought. When we cultivate compassion, we aspire to cultivate first equanimity and equable state with respect to the people we like, the people we don't, the people who would harm us, the people who we know nothing about. It's a state of wholeness in the sense that at that moment, we are not pulling ourselves into attachment or hatred, jealousy, any of those kind of reactive patterns. So from the perspective of the sky of our experience, if you think of our experience as really a vast, vast horizon, perhaps even a horizonless situation. Things are always arising and ceasing. And when we open to a certain relaxed openness of attention or a certain openness of heart, as in compassion, there is a kind of, it takes a certain kind of energy to keep making divisions. Good, bad, samsara, nirvana, want, not want. And we are always chopping the world, most significantly, chopping our own experience into parts. This is good, this is bad. What will I eat for dinner? This was tasty, this is not. What will I watch? What channel of news will I watch? We're always, and there's nothing wrong about this. We can live our lives. And at the same time, from this perspective of wholeness, this dzok, the dzok of Dzogchen, I have found it interesting and useful to just notice when there is more of a state of what I would call wholeness and when there is less. And certainly when we're relaxed and easy, just what we ordinarily consider to be more open, somehow we're not pushing against things so much. We're just here. And many things are here. We might be happy, we might be sad, we might be happy and sad at the same time. That's what a wholeness can encompass. A wholeness is whole because of the variety that contributes to it, that is included in it. As Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche once pointed out, actually a poem in Unbounded Wholeness, that book on Dzogchen of Burn tradition, a wholeness, there's one line, because there are many, there is one. Because there is multiplicity, there is wholeness. So this wholeness doesn't mean a situation that is homogeneous. And actually, in our efforting, and which inevitably reduces our state of wholeness to, certain quarters, certain directionalities of experience, like the good, the tasty, the fun, the entertaining. We, in those kinds of gestures, necessary as they might be, deprive ourselves of a certain kind of multidimensional wholeness, which is filled with variety. Filled with variety. Not excluding anything. Not even excluding samsara. And as you know, I think, this is a principle of Dzogchen, and also even before Dzogchen, as I said, cultivating mindfulness, cultivating love is much more of an orientation to some kind of presence to the entirety of our experience. If you remember, and I'm sure you do, in equanimity, we don't fail to recognize that people are different, that some will harm if they can, some will help. We don't become dull or stupid or indifferent. That is not the equanimity of the four boundless states. Equanimity is that we see it all and our heart remains the same. Good person, may you have happiness and the causes of happiness. Neutral person, my heart is the same. May you have happiness and the causes of happiness. But I know the difference. Harmful person, may you have happiness and the causes of happiness. I know you will hurt me if you can. You have harmed others. That's included in my that knowing is included in my equanimity, but I don't compress my heart in reaction to that. That makes sense? No? Yes, a little bit. I don't mean to say anything complicated. I just mean to call attention to experiences that we all have, different times. There's different ways of experiencing wholeness, certainly. And when we speak of Buddha nature, our real nature, this is a way of calling attention, as you know, to something that itself is not changing and yet is the ground of all change, like space. Everything that you see around you is there because the non-obstructive quality of space. Otherwise, you couldn't have furniture in your house. It's because there is space that there is stuff. Stuff itself is a sign of space. But we generally see stuff as interfering with space. And we see thoughts or emotions of certain kinds as interfering with our kind of inner plenitude of wholeness. And if we think about it in a very basic and simple way, maybe fundamentally what we do in our various different practices, mindfulness, brahmaviharas, certainly wisdom above all, but I'm kind of leaving that aside for the moment and keeping this simple. But all of these, whatever you know about attention, love, wisdom, does it make sense to you to feel that all of these are a way of opening to a certain a degree, a wholeness? Now, what is wholeness? What is that really? I've already said it's variegated. It's not something that is monochromatic. That's what makes it a whole. And we ourselves are that kind of wholeness. Your experience, which really means your consciousness, your awareness, everything that takes place in your entire life takes place within the oceanic expanse of your awareness, your knowing, ultimately your wisdom from the Dzogchen perspective. There is nothing that's outside it, ever. And this is one of the great pieces of good news of the teaching, and it's there from, well, the fundamental good news is that we're never really separate from the ultimate dimension of our being, our truth, our reality. We never are. And, as Longchenpa points out, so long as we are living sentient beings, that is to say, not yet fully awakened in every dimension, we call this the potential, our Rik in Tibetan, which means like family, which is translated by Barron as spiritual potential, but also is really our lineage. It's really our inheritance, our intrinsic, inalienable inheritance as a living being, ignorant or not. We have this, well, we have knowing, right? Everybody has knowing, consciousness, awareness. And what is that? It's the light of our being. When we say, going back to the Theravada canon, the Pali canon, the Anguttara Nikaya, I think it's chapter 1, verse 9, very famous, and Buddha says, "Oh, my children, the nature of your mind is luminous. It is luminous. It is temporarily defiled by adventitious things flowing across that luminosity, but it's fundamentally luminous." Now, what does luminous mean? It doesn't mean that there's like a flashlight in our, but the light of the mind is the quality of knowing. Awareness lights the world for us. this knowing. And we are never, ever, ever, ever separate from this knowing. Practice opens it up, makes it clearer, makes it more available, less likely to be so totally obstructed by the warp and woof of ordinary experience. That's what we practice for. Attention, compassion, wisdom, all of it has to do with opening one way or another to a dimension of our awareness, which naturally has attention, to the dimension of the heart, which, barring severe, severe distorting experiences, really is kindly intended. Even, what was his name? The famous prisoner of Alcatraz, the bird lover of Alcatraz. There was a movie about him. He was, I think, quite a terrible murderer, but he loved to give bird baths. There's some kindness in everyone, some. Or if not, it's a very occluded state, given what our potential for heart opening is. Mindfulness, compassion, wisdom, all of this has an infinite horizon. That's why we call it unbounded wholeness in Dzogchen, or the four unbounded, boundless states. Certain kind of knowing that is unimpeded. When you look at the sky, it's just unimpeded, and we know it. So that's a kind of light. That is fundamental to our being. And this gets emphasized more and more as the traditions get more and more esoteric, you might say, in Mahayana and, middle way theory. As you know, the Dharma inheritance is the emptiness of the mind, the emptiness or openness of the mind, meaning that it's not impossible for the mind really to be stuck in anything. It's not the kind of thing that can get stuck. What is it? And yet we get stuck because we have habit patterns, clouds that come in and assail the open sky of our experience. I think again of Gampopa, 10th century, very significant early figure in the Tibetan tradition, who, in his Jewel Ornament of Liberation, describes an ordinary being, that means us, that means beings who haven't had direct experience of reality, as someone who is separate from the knowing of their actual nature. The Tibetan word is sosogyebo, which literally means a person who is individuated or separated. And Gampopa glosses this as separate from what? Separate, experientially separate, never really separate from our real nature. Another kind of failure to, not failure, another acknowledgement of the way in which we don't live in the wholeness that we are, the expanse of our knowing, which is present in every experience, good and bad. So when we talk about non-duality, when we talk about samsara and nirvana being inseparable and equally part of the great completeness, we're not saying that there's no difference between experiencing samsara and nirvana. We're seeking to recognize that whatever we experience is part of the ocean of our knowing. A wave, a fish, seaweed, It's still part of the ocean of our experience. There's no separating from that. And that is the ultimate joyful good news of all of the traditions, and with particular Buddhist traditions, and really particularly emphasized uh, in our Mahayana and Dzogchen traditions. Everyone is participating in fact, not just participating in, but grounded in your real nature, which gets, among other names, the name Buddha nature. Why not? The nature of awakening. It is the nature of consciousness, of knowing to be awake and to have the capacity to awaken further. So for me, this has become quite a significant way of, and simple, that's important, simple, experience near way of reflecting on the a fundamental orientation of the practices that we do. So I'll stop here. We could see if you would like to say something from your own experience for maybe 2 minutes. A couple people would like to. You're welcome. You could just unmute yourself. Maybe you have your own way of understanding this, or maybe you'd like me to clarify something I said.
May I ask something?
Please.
I don't know if this is going to take it to another direction, but I keep thinking of this quote by Trungpa Rinpoche when he said that we cannot watch our own funeral. Is this related to what you're saying?
I can make it related, maybe. What does that mean to you, that you can't see your own funeral?
Oh, I just kind of quickly took a look at it, and it's related to if one attains enlightenment and leaves the ego behind, the identity of the self, then there's no one more to watch that enlightenment, because the awareness is so open that there's not the separation anymore.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Because as you said, the ego is exactly what keeps us from that full awakening, that wholeness. That's the mechanism, so to speak, for, pulling down the shades and the open universe. So yes, I think it does relate. I think that's a very lovely example. Thank you. Well, we'll have a chance to reflect again at the close of our meditation. As you know, we're having this experiment and conversation afterwards. So,
yeah, at noon Central Time, we will have a Dharma conversation for 45 minutes. Everybody's invited. We have our meditation at 11 Central Time, and then at 12 noon, we will have a Dharma conversation. So
we'll take a break. And if you do have thoughts burgeoning, there'll be space for them again. Thank you, everyone.